Lord, at the beginning of this week, I do not come forward as if everything is starting from nothing, because I understand that what lies ahead does not erase what already exists within me. And stepping into these days without first placing them in your hands would only lead me to repeat what is already proven to be incomplete. That is why I come before you now, not from urgency and not from routine, but with the awareness that how this week is established at the beginning will influence how it unfolds in everything that follows. And I do not want to enter it relying on my own understanding or depending on what seems reasonable to me in the moment. There are things I cannot see yet, situations that have not presented themselves, and decisions that have not yet been required. And even though they are not visible now, they will still become part of what I face. And I recognize that if I begin without placing this week in your hands, I will eventually rely on what I think I know instead of what you have already determined. Your word reveals that man is not in control of his own path, and that it is not within him to direct his own steps. And that truth removes the illusion that I can carry this week on my own without consequence, because even when it seems possible, it is never complete. Father, I place this entire week before you, not in parts and not selectively, but completely, including what I expect and what I do not expect, what I am prepared for and what I am not prepared for, because I understand that leaving anything outside of your hands is choosing to carry it myself. And I do not want to divide what should be fully surrendered. What is placed in your hands does not depend on my control, and what is not placed there eventually becomes a weight that I was never meant to carry. As this week begins, I am not asking for everything to be clear from the start, nor am I asking to see every outcome in advance, because I understand that clarity is not what sustains me. Alignment is what sustains me, and alignment does not require full visibility in order to remain steady. Your word teaches in Proverbs 3:5-6 that I am to trust in you with all my heart and not lean on my own understanding, and that I am to acknowledge you in all my ways so that you may direct my path. And I choose to establish that now, not later, not after decisions are made, but at the beginning, where direction is set before movement takes place. Lord, I do not want to move forward and then return later trying to correct what should have been aligned from the start. And I do not want to build this week on what seems right to me only to discover that it lacks foundation. That is why I place it before you now, not as an afterthought, but as the starting point, because what begins correctly does not need to be constantly repaired, and what is established in you carries a steadiness that does not depend on circumstance. There will be moments where things move quickly, where decisions will not allow time for careful consideration, and where responses will be required immediately. And in those moments, what has been established now will determine how I respond then. That is why this is not simply a moment of speaking, but a moment of positioning, because what is positioned correctly at the beginning remains active when everything else begins to move. Father, I understand that this week will not unfold according to my expectations in every detail, and that there will be things that do not go as planned. But placing this week in your hands is not about controlling outcomes. It is about not walking independently from you, because even when things are uncertain, what is in your hands is not unstable, and what is guided by you does not lose direction even when it is not fully understood. Your word declares that the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and that means that direction is not created in the moment, but set before the step is taken. And I choose to trust that truth instead of trying to define everything as it comes. I do not need to create direction on my own when I have already placed this week in your hands, and I do not need to depend on what I can see when you are not limited to what is visible, Lord. I do not want this to remain as something I said at the beginning and then moved past, but as something that continues to define how I walk through everything that follows. Because placing this week in your hands is not a single act. It is a position that remains. What is truly surrendered does not need to be repeatedly forced into place. It remains where it was placed. Father, as this week unfolds, let what has been established here remain steady. not needing to be rebuilt with every situation, not needing to be reconsidered with every decision, but present as the foundation of how I move, how I respond, and how I remain. Because what is in your hands does not lose its place when things begin to change. And what is aligned with you does not need to shift every time circumstances do. So I leave this week in your hands from the beginning, not partially and not conditionally, but completely. Understanding that this is not about making everything easy, but about not walking through it alone, and about not taking upon myself what belongs to you, because what is placed in your hands remains under your authority, and that is where it belongs from the start. Lord, as this week has now been placed in your hands from the very beginning, I do not want that act to remain only as something spoken, but as something that carries weight in how I move forward. Because placing this week before you is not only about acknowledging you at the start, but about recognizing that everything that unfolds is still under what has already been surrendered. I do not want to separate what I have entrusted to you from how I respond when things begin to take shape, back when circumstances begin to shift. There are moments within a week that test whether what was established at the beginning remains active or becomes distant. And those moments do not always come with warning, nor do they always allow time to pause and reconsider. There are situations that demand immediate response, conversations that unfold without preparation, and decisions that require movement even when there is no full clarity. And in those moments, what governs my response will not be what I intended to do at the start, but what has actually remained established within me. That is why placing this week in your hands cannot remain as something I simply recall, but as something that continues to define how I walk through what I face. Your word reveals in Psalm 37:5 that I am to commit my way to you, to trust in you, and that you will act. And that truth does not only apply to long-term direction, but to the unfolding of each moment within this week. Committing my way is not a single declaration. It is a position that continues. And trusting you is not limited to what is easy to accept, but extends to what I do not yet understand. I do not want to move through this week holding on to what I have already given to you, because what is surrendered is not meant to be carried again. Father, there is a tendency to begin correctly, and then gradually return to self-reliance as the day fills with activity. And I recognize that this shift does not always happen intentionally, but it happens when attention is redirected, and when what surrounds me becomes louder than what had already been established. That is why I need what has been placed in your hands to remain active beyond this moment, not as something fragile that is easily replaced, but as something firm that continues regardless of what the week brings. Lord, I do not want to respond to situations based on urgency alone, nor do I want to make decisions based solely on what appears in front of me, because what appears is not always complete, and reacting to what is incomplete often leads to responses that lack direction. What has been placed in your hands already includes what I cannot yet see, and because of that, I do not need to define everything as it comes, nor do I need to rely on what seems immediate in order to move forward. Your word teaches in Isaiah 26:3 that you keep in perfect peace the one whose mind is stayed on you, and that reveals that steadiness is not found in the absence of difficulty, but in remaining aligned regardless of what unfolds. I do not want my responses to shift depending on how things go, nor do I want my direction to change based on what I feel in each moment, because what is placed in your hands is not dependent on my perception. It is sustained by your authority. Father, as this week continues to unfold, I understand that there will be moments where it may seem easier to take control again, to handle things based on what I can manage, and to move forward relying on what I think is sufficient, but I do not want to return to that place. What I have placed in your hands does not need to be reclaimed in order to be handled correctly, and stepping back into control does not improve what has already been surrendered. It only reintroduces limitation. Lord, I also recognize that there will be moments where things do not align with expectation, where outcomes are not what I anticipated, and where direction is not immediately clear. But placing this week in your hands was not based on expectation. It was based on trust. And trust is not dependent on understanding everything as it happens. What you establish does not lose its place when circumstances change. And what is guided by you does not become uncertain simply because I do not fully see the outcome. Your word declares that those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but remains forever. And that stability is not formed in the moment of pressure, but established beforehand. I do not want to attempt to create steadiness in the middle of what I face. I want to remain within what has already been established by placing this week in your hands from the beginning. Father, let there be continuity between what has been surrendered and how I walk, so that there is no division between the beginning of this week and how it continues. I do not want to carry one posture before you and another when I move into what is ahead, because what is divided does not remain steady, and what is not steady cannot remain aligned. Lord, as I continue through everything that this week will bring, I do not take back what has been placed in your hands. I do not redefine what has already been established, and I do not shift based on what appears, because what is in your hands remains under your authority, and that does not change when everything else does. What was placed in God's hands at the beginning of this week is not meant to become something distant or symbolic, but something that continues to hold its place, without needing to be repeated constantly in words, because true surrender is not sustained by repetition, but by remaining where it was first entrusted. There is a difference between saying something has been given to God and actually leaving it there, because it is possible to speak correctly while still carrying the same internal weight. And when that happens, nothing has truly shifted. Only the language has changed while the burden remains. When something is genuinely placed in his hands, it is no longer sustained by personal effort, nor managed by constant internal review, because what is under his authority does not require human control to remain in place. What has not been fully released continues to occupy the mind, reappears in thought, and influences reactions, not because it needs to be handled again, but because it was never truly left where it was meant to remain. That is why the beginning of this week was not only about placing everything before God, but about allowing it to stay there without being reclaimed as the days move forward. Scripture instructs in Psalm 55-22 to cast your burden on the Lord and he will sustain you. And that instruction is not about temporary relief, but about a transfer that is meant to remain. Casting something implies that it is no longer being held in the same way. And if it is repeatedly picked back up, then it has not stayed where it was placed. The act itself is not incomplete, but it becomes ineffective when what was surrendered is taken back under personal responsibility, even if only in thought. As this week unfolds, there will be moments that subtly attempt to draw attention back to what has already been entrusted, not always through visible pressure, but through thoughts that revisit what was already released, through concern that tries to reorganize what has already been placed before God, and through the familiar pattern of trying to regain control over what feels uncertain. These moments do not require resurrender. They require not reclaiming what has already been given up, because what is in his hands has not lost its place simply because it is no longer being actively considered. There is a natural tendency to believe that something must be constantly monitored in order to remain secure. But what has been placed in God's hands is not maintained by attention. It is maintained by his authority. And his authority does not fluctuate based on human awareness. What depends on constant mental revisiting has not been surrendered. It has only been paused, but what has been truly entrusted remains steady even when attention shifts to other responsibilities throughout the day. The word teaches in 1 Peter 5-7 to cast all anxieties on him because he cares for you, and that care is not activated by repetition, nor sustained by constant verbal acknowledgement, but by the fact that what has been given over remains under his care regardless of whether it is being actively thought about. Carrying something after it has been surrendered only reintroduces a weight that was never meant to return. and it shifts the responsibility back to a place that was never designed to hold it. There will be moments where the mind attempts to with what has already been released, not because it needs to be handled again, but because it is familiar to hold on to it. Familiarity does not make something necessary, and returning to what has already been surrendered does not improve it. It only places it back under personal limitation. What has been entrusted does not need to be managed again. It needs to remain where it was placed. That is why the continuation of this week is not about repeating the same act of surrender, but about remaining within it. Remaining does not require constant reinforcement through words. It requires not stepping outside of what has already been established. What has been placed in his hands stays there, not because it is being restated, but because it has not been taken back. That distinction is what prevents the cycle of carrying what has already been given up. Outcomes do not determine whether something remains in God's hands. What is under his authority is not affected by, and what has been entrusted does not lose its place when circumstances shift, or when understanding is incomplete. There is also a difference between acting responsibly and caring. While surrender involves not carrying what was never meant to be controlled, confusing the two leads to taking on what belongs to God while still trying to fulfill what has been assigned personally, and that creates a weight that was never intended to exist. What has been placed in his hands remains his, even as actions are taken within the week. So as this week continues, the focus is not on returning to the beginning as if something was left undone, but on allowing what was already established to remain unchanged. What was placed in God's hands does not need to be redefined. It does not need to be secured again, and it does not need to be managed in order to remain valid. It stays where it was placed, not because it is being remembered, but because it has not been removed. And that is what allows there to be steadiness without constant effort, not the repetition of words, but the consistency of not taking back what has already been entrusted. As this week continues to unfold, what was placed in God's hands at the beginning does not lose its place simply because time has moved forward or because new situations have appeared. What has been entrusted is not dependent on the stage of the week, nor does it require reaffirmation in order to remain valid. It was not placed there temporarily, nor was it given under certain conditions. It was placed there with the understanding that it would remain under his authority beyond what can be seen, beyond what can be anticipated, and beyond what can be controlled. There is a tendency to treat surrender as something that belongs only to the beginning, as if it were an introduction to the week rather than the foundation of it. But what has been established at the start was not meant to remain at the surface. It was meant to define everything that follows. What is truly given to God does not stay confined to a moment of acknowledgement. It continues to hold its place even when attention shifts, even when responsibilities increase, and even when circumstances demand movement without pause. That is what distinguishes what is real from what is only spoken. The word declares in Proverbs 16:2-3, to commit your works to the Lord and your plans will be established. And that instruction does not suggest a repeated act driven by uncertainty, but a transfer that results in stability. Committing something is not an act that loses effect over time, and it does not require constant reapplication in order to remain active. What has been committed does not return to its original state unless it is taken back, and taking it back does not strengthen it. It only places it once again under limitation. As the week progresses, there may be moments where outcomes are not clear, where direction is not immediately evident, and where what unfolds does not match what was expected. But those moments do not redefine where everything has been placed. What is under God's authority is not affected by human uncertainty, and what has been entrusted does not become unstable, because it is not fully understood. The absence of clarity does not remove it from his hands, and the presence of pressure does not require reclaiming it. There is also a difference between engaging with what is happening and carrying what was already surrendered, because engagement requires attention and action, while carrying implies ownership and control. What has been placed in God's hands does not need to be owned. Again, in order to be addressed correctly, it remains under his authority even as actions are taken within the week. And that distinction prevents the unnecessary weight that comes from trying to manage what was never meant to be held again. The word teaches in Psalm 37:23 that the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and that truth reveals that direction is not created in the moment, but set before the step is taken. What was placed in God's hands at the beginning of this week already includes what lies ahead, even if it is not visible now. Because of that, there is no need to attempt to define every step as it comes, nor to rely on personal understanding to maintain direction. What has been established does not require constant adjustment. It requires remaining within it. There may also be moments where the mind attempts to return to what has already been entrusted. It only reintroduces limitation. What has been placed in God's hands does not benefit from being reconsidered it repeatedly, because its position has not changed. It remains exactly where it was placed, regardless of whether it is being actively thought about. The word declares, in Isaiah 55:8-9, that his thoughts are not our thoughts and his ways are not our ways, and that removes the expectation that everything must align with personal understanding in order to remain secure. What is under his authority does not require agreement in order to remain valid, and it does not depend on human perception to maintain its place. That is why what has been entrusted does not need to be evaluated continuously. It needs to be left where it was placed. As this week continues toward its completion, but because it has not been removed, that is what sustains steadiness. So what was entrusted at the beginning of this week remains under his authority now, not partially and not conditionally, but completely. It does not shift with circumstance, it does not weaken with time, and it does not require human effort to remain in place. It stays where it was placed, because it was given with the understanding that it belongs there. And what belongs in God's hands does not need to be reclaimed in order to be sustained. It remains exactly where it was left, under his authority, from the beginning to the end of this week. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.